I don't know what I had seen on that particular summer in the Philippines. Alright, before I jump into it, I'll give you a little bit of background. My grandparents lived in a small village and owned a very, very old and very large wooden house. I remember staying at that house every summer when I was little, and that the bugs were huge. The moths alone were as big as my face. The surrounding area, it was very lush and very green. It was usually suffocatingly hot during the day. At night, I remember the house creaking and moaning with the wind. I don't think I ever thought that was creepy when I was a kid. My nanny, which is common to have in the Philippines, would sleep in my room with me, so I never felt alone or helpless. I also had a rosary around my neck, one that my parents had given me when I was a baby. I often caressed it if I was feeling scared. Anyway, there wasn't much to be afraid of. Crime was nearly non-existent in this small community. Everyone knew each other. Of course, since it was the countryside, houses and neighbours were pretty far apart. Okay, so this is where I bring up the bridge. I can't talk about everything else without first talking about that bridge. There was this small, simple, rust-red bridge, maybe 20 feet long, over a little dried-up stream. There was an overgrowth of weeds and plants that surrounded the bridge, and you couldn't really see it, not until you were near it. This bridge, it led to a very thick forest, and I was absolutely forbidden to go through it, according to my nanny anyway. The other details of it are a little hazy, but I distinctly remember its red colouring. For some reason, its colour was the subject of speculation by other kids in the village. Tate said the bridge was made of iron, but it's rusted now, so it's not safe to cross. Bayani, the son of the local rice farmer, said. No, said Mildred, with wide, terrified eyes. My yaya said it was made by a bruja, and it's made of children's blood. I looked at Mildred and I said, I think your yaya told you that because you're such a brat and she wants to kill you. I said this teasingly, and I swear that doesn't sound as horrible in Filipino. But she still gave me a reproachful look. I laughed and I turned to look at Lou, the quiet kid among us and the bastard son of a rice cake peddler, which, in the Philippines, is about the equivalent of a milkman. To my surprise, he spoke up. No, he said quietly. Nane said that it's a portal to the netherworld, so we should never go there. We all stared at him, surprised that he'd contributed to the conversation. Then, Mildred piped up. What do you know? You don't even know your father. Ha ha ha. She screamed with laughter. Bayani hit her arm and she immediately started crying. We rolled our eyes. We knew that it hadn't hurt her at all. When I heard my yaya call out to me for dinner, I ran to her, and I remember the rest of that day was spent thinking about what Lou had said. Speculation about the bridge was usually about exactly just the bridge, but Lou had insisted that it led to something sinister, which caught my rapt attention. It wasn't the bridge itself that we should have been concerned about, but it was where the bridge led. He and I would sit at the start of the bridge, fearful to cross it, not because of possible danger, but because of what my yaya would have done to us if she ever found out we did. "Look," Lou said one afternoon. "Do you want to see that?" He pointed into the thicket. "What?" I asked, squinting to see. "There's a path," he said. I looked harder. There was a path, but it disappeared into the trees, and there was no way we could know where it led, not just from looking at it. One lazy and particularly hot afternoon, the four of us played hide and seek, and Lou was it. Lou almost immediately found me. I was sitting in the overgrowth of plants near the bridge, my back to it. "I knew I would find you here," he said in a whisper. I laughed. "Why are you whispering?" I asked him, amused. It was then that I noticed he was not looking at me, but looking past me. "What are you looking at?" I whispered, anxiously. I suddenly felt the heavy weight of dread in my heart, in my throat. It felt like it was closing up. He said nothing. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and the colour drained from his face. It was clear that his gaze was affixed to something, and I dreaded to turn around and find out what it was. It felt like the heat had become more intense, and the humidity, it soaked my clothes in cold sweat. I slowly turned my head to look at the bridge, but before it came into view, Lou grabbed my arm and started running. He was taller than me, and his legs longer. I felt like I hardly touched the ground. Lou kept running and running until we saw Bayani and Mildred just a few feet away. Suddenly, my foot caught on a rock and we tumbled. I absent-mindedly grabbed the rosary around my neck and I accidentally tore it off in my tumble. I felt my left ankle snap as I landed on it the wrong way. I dropped the rosary in my hand and I cried out in pain. "What the heck are you guys doing?" Bayani yelled as he and Mildred jogged towards us. At that point I was overcome with pain, and Lou kept apologizing. Mildred ran to my grandparents' house to call my yaya. That night, I found out that I had broken my ankle after the doctor came to our house. I remember being disgusted by the man. He was the tallest man that I'd ever seen, and also the palest. But he was very fat. I remember feeling his weight sinking the wooden floors near my bed as he examined my ankle. My hand instinctively reached for my neck in search of the rosary, but I remembered I had lost it in my tumble that afternoon. My grandmother invited him to stay for dinner, and he obliged. The doctor sat at one end of our large mahogany dinner table. My grandfather sat on the other end. My grandmother sat with my yaya next to her, and Lou and I sat next to each other. Lou was penitent all through the rest of the day and refused to go home. When my nanny called his mother, she was not home. "Of course he can stay with us," my grandmother said after my nanny asked her. My grandmother was a very gracious and kind woman. My grandfather was not unkind, but he was sterner, with a loud and boisterous voice. "So, doctor," he said at dinner, "you're new around here. What do you think of this place?" My grandfather finished off the remaining mango juice in his glass, and my yaya filled it once more. The doctor was chewing his food when my grandfather asked, and I could hear the food sloshing around in his mouth. His breathing was very loud, almost like he was snoring. But he was obviously awake. He swallowed loudly, "It's very peaceful," the doctor replied, wiping the corners of his mouth but somehow missing the bits of food on his chin entirely. "It is very different here from Manila, but I don't miss it. This is home now." My grandfather liked the sound of that. "I'm glad you feel that way," Grandfather said. "The nearest doctor is quite far from here. I am glad that we finally have one within the community." He made approving noises as he drank from his glass. "So where do you live around here, Doctor?" Grandmother inquired. "I didn't even know you had moved into our community until I asked Georgia next door if she had the doctor's number. She told me that she saw a man with a doctor's bag crossing the bridge the other day, and that he was headed to Juan's house in the trees. I was surprised to hear someone had moved in without my knowing," she chuckled. "Us old people are pretty nosy." The doctor smiled his closed-mouthed smile. "Yes, well, my brother is very ill," he said. "I came here from Manila just days ago to care for him. I haven't really had the time to introduce myself to everyone. I've been with him day and night, ensuring his fast recovery." He then asked my yaya for water, and she smiled politely. "Juan used to have a ranch around there, didn't he?" my grandmother asked him, and he nodded. "Yes, but not anymore. He has a few chickens now and a horse, but nothing more." Then he turned his head to me. "Is your ankle feeling all right?" he asked me. Something about the question had an ingenuine quality to me, but no one seemed to notice. But then I noticed Lou's eyes never left his plate. When I simply stared at him and he didn't reply, my grandmother laughed. "Hey, the nice man asked you a question." I looked at her and then to him. His gaze made my skin crawl. "I feel fine, thank you," I replied politely. Lou's arm grazed mine, and I felt his goosebumps. The doctor then smiled his unreadable smile. "Good," he said. "It should heal up nicely. But I wouldn't go running around with your friends anytime soon. Especially not at that infernal bridge," my grandfather added, a harbinger for tetanus and other dangers. The adults made a noise of agreement. After dinner, Lou and I were dismissed so that the adults could talk and smoke cigarettes. In Filipino culture, it is polite for children to take the adult's hand and press it to their foreheads, either in greeting or goodbye. Traditionally, it was a kiss on the hand, but that is considered old-fashioned. I, along with Lou, pressed my grandfather's hand to my forehead, and he kissed the top of our heads. I did the same for my grandmother, and she too kissed our heads. When I walked away after that, my grandfather clicked his tongue in disapproval. "Come back here," he said. "Why would you be so rude to our guest?" I turned to limp back to the table and to the doctor. My grandfather apologized for me. When I reached the doctor, he held his hand out expectantly. I took his sausage-like fingers into my hand. I remember how cold and clammy they were. I pressed them to my forehead, smelling dinner on them. Lou timidly did the same. As I pulled away, the doctor gave us a small smile and whispered, "Thank you." Lou and I sat in our bedroom with my yaya, who was reading her magazine. Lou and I played some cards and said nearly nothing. When we heard the adults' conversation move outside to the front of the house, we went to the window to look down. The doctor was saying his farewell, and We could hear grandmother and grandfather chuckling and thanking him. They chatted for a couple of minutes more, until the doctor said he really had to get back to his brother. When he was about to leave, he looked up at us and raised his hand in a wave. Lou and I, we said nothing, and he laughed, and we watched him cross the bridge and disappear into the trees. That night, Lou and I laid awake in bed, the sheet up to our chins despite the hot weather. I waited for Yaya's snoring before I nudged him. "Are you up?" I whispered. He slowly nodded his head. "Lou, what did you see at the bridge this afternoon?" I turned my head to look at him, only to find him with furrowed brows, staring up at the ceiling. "Past the bridge. I saw that, Doctor," he whispered back. "With..." He paused. "With a pale man, slung across his shoulders." As he said those words, I felt my heart beating wildly against my chest. Then Lou added, He saw us." "How's your ankle?" Bayani asked. My friends decided to hang out with me in my bedroom a while the next day. Mildred was looking at the clothes in my closet and Lou was playing with my crutches. "It's really sore," I replied. "I can't do much." "Hey, that's not true. Why don't you come outside with us? We could catch some lizards," Bayani offered. Mildred snorted in disgust. "That's nasty. No," she said. Bayani made a face. "I don't think I asked you, brat," he sneered. She threw a slipper at him and he ducked. She breathed out heavily and plunked down on the edge of my bed. Everyone was really bored. And then Mildred had a suggestion. "We should cross that bridge and see what's beyond it." The room was quiet. Lou rested my crutches against the wall. "I don't think that's a good idea at all," I said. "Even the adults never cross that bridge. There is nothing there but poisonous plants and huge bugs," Mildred scoffed. "Everyone is boring here," she said. "Everyone in town is really old and boring. Why would they explore anything?" She paused and then added, "The doctor lives there. So why disturb him? He is taking care of his brother. The last thing he wants is children bothering him," I said, making an effort to hide my anxiety. Mildred, of course, picked it up immediately. "Why don't you like that doctor?" she asked. "I think it's a bad idea," Lou interrupted before I could respond. I gave him a relieved look. It was then Bayani piped up. "I think it's not as bad an idea. The doctor will not mind visitors. Anyway, we wouldn't stay there long. We would just visit." He looked out my window and to the bridge. "But that bridge is dangerous," I said desperately. Bayani laughed. "Okay, how about I ask my parents for permission?" I know that they had tried to visit him one afternoon to give him a housewarming gift, but they said he wasn't home. "I'm sure my parents would like it if I gave him their basket for them," he said, before I could say anything to deter him. He said, "Come on, Mildred, let's go." And they left. After a few minutes, Lou and I watched Bayani and Mildred walking to the bridge. "Why would his parents let him even cross that bridge?" I said incredulously. Lou shrugged. "Everyone sees the doctor crossing it. I guess it's maybe not as dangerous as everyone thought." We waited and waited for Bayani and Mildred to appear from the woods. In the first hour of waiting, I thought that things were going to be fine, and as my Yaya often told me, I was just imagining things. After the third hour, and as the sun was slowly disappearing, I worried. Lou had fallen asleep. Yaya would check on me every now and then, and I would tell her I'm fine, and she would leave me alone. Eventually, I fell asleep too. "Wake up," I heard Yaya say, as I woke up to a hand gently shaking me. There she was, leaning over me, and she smiled and woke up Lou. "What's happening?" I asked confusedly. Lou stretched awake. "Your friends are here," she said, and I heard Bayani and Mildred going up the stairs. I let out a sigh of relief. When they reached my room, Yaya left. Bayani and Mildred looked very excited. "His house is beautiful," Mildred said. "It's enormous," Bayani said. The two of them were excitedly talking over each other, describing the doctor's house. When I asked if there was anything weird they noticed, they immediately shook their heads. Then Mildred said, "Well, there was one thing," she said. "There was this really bad smell coming from the upstairs towards the back of the house." As she said that, I felt a pit in my stomach. And I thought it was weird that he wouldn't let us see the backyard. He said there was a lot of junk there that needs to be cleaned up, Bayani added. "Why did you want to see his backyard?" Lou asked. Bayani shrugged. "I wanted to see the animals," he said. "And I remember Father telling me that the stream came from the mountain and near Mr. Wan's house. I wanted to see how far the stream reached." He shrugged again. "Stupid, since the stream is dried up," Mildred chided. I ignored her comment. "Did you see his brother, Mr. Wan?" I asked them. And they shook their heads. "He's sick, and the doctor said that he needed his rest," Bayani said. "Why would we want to see a sick man anyway? The house was so beautiful. We didn't really care," Mildred said. The rest of the conversation was about the grand piano in Mr. Wan's house, the tall ceilings, the echo, etc. The next day, it rained heavily. The rain in the Philippines, it can be such a heavy downpour, and the rain on that day was exactly that. The rain was so heavy, everything looked like a blur. The trees, the other houses. There was a blackout, and we had to use candles. I remember sitting at my bedroom window, just looking out towards the bridge and the trees, but it was impossible to see. I don't know why I stared at it. I just felt like maybe the doctor would appear suddenly as a large demon screaming towards our house and ready to eat me. Even though I knew that was a ridiculous imagining, I couldn't look away. The rain stopped, sometime in the middle of the night, I think. I remember being awoken by a different sound from the crickets, not like the nighttime birds. I sat up in bed, and I listened carefully to distinguish the sound. It was the sound of water, but not rain, more like a stream. I hobbled over to the window. "What are you doing?" my Yaya asked sleepily. She walked over to me and looked at what I was looking at. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "There is water under that bridge again." The next day, people used the stream for everything. Drinking water, washing clothes, bathing. Then, after a few days, the water seemed to turn rancid, and suddenly, the people who used the stream got very sick. When someone's young child died, there was an uproar. "We have to know what happened to this water," the child's mother said, and others agreed. "Where is the doctor? Why has no one called him?" another cried. Among the din of outraged protests, Mildred spoke up. "Bayani and I tried to visit him yesterday, but the ground was too muddy and slippery. From where we stood, it didn't seem like anyone was home anyway. But the other doctor is 2 hours away. We need the doctor." Everyone was yelling angrily and desperately until the barangay captain, the elected official of the community, spoke up. "Let us go to Mr. Wan's house and see the doctor." Everyone shouted in agreement, and, like a mob, they walked into the thicket. I couldn't go with them because of my injury, so this is how I remember Lou described the events that followed to me. There was an awful smell of rot that had started at about 20 feet from Mr. Wan's property. The ground was muddy and slippery from the rain, and it was a difficult hike that the older people stayed behind. But Lou, Bayani, Mildred, my grandparents, and all the other people, they trekked onwards. He said that as they approached the property, the smell was so putrid and rotten that he felt a sharp sting in his nostrils. At some point, Mildred went to stay behind with the old people. When they all reached Mr. Wan's door, they banged on it, but no answer came. They banged and banged and banged on it, but again, no answer. Impatient and angry, they all went around the house to see the back. They saw the stream. It was almost a full river. It was running forcefully, but then they found the source of that terrible odor. There was what looked like a horse lying on its side in the stream. A tree had fallen, and it stopped the horse from going with the current. The horse was dead, but it was not the only source of the rancid smell. In the stream, dead chickens lay near to the horse, just stewing in the water, rotting. Some people retched at the sight and the smell of rot. Lou said that when he and grandfather and the barangay captain closed in on the horse, they immediately noticed something extremely odd and unsettling. The horse and the chickens and a few stray dogs that laid in the water, they were all dried up. As in, they looked deflated and dry. Lou had a hard time explaining it. Another thing they noticed was that all the dead animals had their throats slashed, but there was no sign of blood anywhere. Confused and outraged, Lou said my grandfather stormed to the back door of the house and broke a window. He opened the door from the other side, and again, the rancid smell filled their nostrils. But this time, it seemed to come from upstairs. Lou and Bayani entered the house with my grandfather and the barangay captain, as well as a few other men. But they told the two children to stay at the foot of the stairs. The men went up, footsteps echoing. Then suddenly, the footsteps and the shuffling stopped. It was silent for a moment. When the men started to come down the stairs again, they said nothing. Only their shoes on the wooden stairs could be heard. "What happened? What is it?" Bayani asked excitedly. No one paid him any attention. Frustrated, he ran up the stairs. "No, Bayani!" Lou shouted. running after him. Lou said the smell was so bad, it stung his eyes. There were several rooms in the upstairs, but only one door was open, and it happened to be the source of the smell. Bayani reached it first, and as he ran to the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. And then he started to vomit. When Lou came into the room, he described to me what he saw, with great difficulty. "It was Mr. Wan," he said. He started to cry, and he wiped his tears away angrily with his hand. "Mr. Wan, his mouth was open, like screaming but with no sound, and he was so skinny, his skin clung to his bones. He was so pale, and the maggots, flies." He cried fully then. "He was the one that the doctor was carrying on his shoulders, that one time we were playing. It was like all the blood had gone from his body. His throat, it had a large cut on it," he sobbed. I comforted him, although I was terrified. Where was the doctor?" I stammered, fearful of the answer. "We couldn't find him. Everyone looked everywhere." He sniffled and then added, "That's not all. The barangay captain, he said that the cut in his throat, it looked like it was healed and then cut again, over and over for weeks, until it was finally cut deep enough to kill him." After the incident, the police from outside the community came to investigate. They could find nothing, only the fact that the animals in the stream had really been drained of blood, and so was Mr. Wan. There was no information about the doctor, and I remember the police finding it ridiculous that no one knew his name. "We simply call him Doctor," my grandmother once told them when she was questioned. "Nothing bad ever happens here. We never thought..." The next day, my parents came to pick me up. Not much was said to me, and I remember saying goodbye to my friends. I didn't see much of them or the village again after that, and my grandparents, they visited us from then on. After some time, that whole incident was forgotten. A year or so later, my grandmother told us that Mr. Wan's house had been burned down and that the bridge was torn down. I suppose that's for the best. I had not thought about this for years and years, until this morning. Sometimes, no matter how traumatizing something can be, life goes on, regardless, and you just forget about it. But even if you forget, it doesn't really mean that it never happened. The thing that brought back all of this was in my apartment, thousands of miles away in Los Angeles. I found the rosary, the one that I'd torn off and lost all those years ago. It was resting against my pillow when I woke up this morning.